So my name is Manish. I'm from India. I live in India, a faraway magical place called Rajasthan. Has anyone been to Rajasthan or heard of Rajasthan? So if you have heard, or you're most welcome to come. It's one of the most amazing places I've been to, and that's why I love it. And I'm from there originally, and I've been living there for the last 20 years almost. So I have to confess first, I'm feeling really nervous. Also, particularly at a Learning Reimagined conference, to be standing with a mic in front is a bit of an awkward oxymoron and paradox, so I'm very conscious and aware of that. So, but I also would like my grandmother, she was actually a brilliant unschooler herself. She never went to school, grew up in the village, one of my role models for this journey that we've been on. And she always reminded me, when you're getting nervous, have some fun, play some games. So I'd like to invite you if we could play a little game. Is that cool, for like a couple of minutes? So, and you get to learn a Hindi word. This is a Hindi lesson for you. Namaste. Do you know namaste? Everyone knows what it means? Yeah? No? So it means basically the whole divine being in me bows to the whole divine being in you, and we see each other fully. We commit to trying to see each other and understand each other fully as full beings. So I haven't come here as, I mean, I flew all the way from India, but I haven't come as some kind of expert. Actually, I've come to actually learn and understand all the brilliant, amazing things you guys are doing here. And also to share a couple of invitations. So I've really come in the spirit of friendship to connect many different communities around the world which are in these explorations. So what we wanted to do was to take about 15 minutes and hopefully, so part of this day is to figure out one invitation that we often use is, there are no strangers in the world, only the people who I haven't hugged yet. So, so use this time right now, to maybe find 2 or 3 people, and the invitation was to share our own journeys of how did we end up here? Like, what's happened in our lives that we ended up in this room together? Like, what has been there's another thing, one of my favorite quotes is, I prefer to take the company of those searching for the truth rather than those who think they found it. So I think we are all a community of seekers, and that's the exciting part, is that very ancient purpose of human beings as seekers. We're reconnecting to that. And so I would invite you to, let's take 15 minutes and find 3 people you don't know, and each person can take 3-4 minutes each to kind of share their journey of how they ended up in this room. Like, I'm sure my mother would love to know. She's always says, where did I go wrong? How did you end up like that? So, so can we do this for about 15 minutes? Let's connect and meet new people in the room. I thought it would be nice to give you a sense of, teleport you and take you to India for a few minutes to give you a sense of some of my inspiration for when we started talking about, my wife and I started exploring what does freedom in learning mean. So rural India and indigenous India is a big part of our inspiration. So as I said, how was, by the way, the conversations for people? Was it? Yeah? Good, yeah. So I thought I'll share a little bit of my story and a little bit of what we're doing in India for the next 15-20 minutes, and then we can have more of a open conversation and things. Is that good for everyone? Okay. So, so part of what I wanted to do was to, when talking about Learning Reimagined, is to invite you and do some, share some invitations with you of how do we actually frame this. So Zakia had shared one invitation in the morning, right? So one of the things that, if we really want to reimagine learning, then there's one invitation that we enter into a process of unlearning or exploring our own unlearning journeys in that. And so I think the boards outside are theirs to, so one question is, if we want to really reimagine learning, what do we each have to unlearn to enter into that deeper process? The second invitation I would like to share with you is that for me, I don't see myself as, and the work we're doing and the way we're living in India as part of a kind of a Western or a hippie or a New Age kind of movement. So in India, we would trace at least the idea of self-designed learning at least 5,000 years ago. So this is not a new movement. This is a very rich lineage that we all are tied. And if we go back to indigenous people, it's even longer, the lineage that we're all connecting to. So it's very important because we use, oftentimes, part of what schooling does is really fragment our senses, our notions of time and space and who we are and how we're connected to each other. So if you go to things like the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads, you'll find many stories of people talking about their self-designed learning journeys. And there was already at that time this struggle between kind of centralized authority and institutions and people's own autonomous living and learning processes. In some ways, it's like the formal official sector versus the informal, daily life of how we actually live, So there's always a tension between that. So the other thing I would say, there was actually in India also, have you heard of Rabindranath Tagore? So he was a freedom fighter and poet. And so this is another situation that actually all over India, many of the freedom fighters had very radical critiques of schooling at that time. And so I see much of what we are also doing as part of this lineage of freedom fighters, where I, at least, and I invite you all to think about that also, how you situate yourselves. And Tagore wrote a very important and beautiful story. He was a poet also, and for those who care, he won the Nobel Prize for poetry. But he was, lots of interesting stories around him. But a story he wrote was called The Parrot's Training. And he used the metaphor of a golden cage that was built to civilize the wild parrot and all the efforts that were done. And so I was so inspired by that story, I rewrote it and updated it to the kind of context. So there's a book here, which some copies I have as gifts for those who are interested, can take. But what stuck was the metaphor of the cage, schooling as a cage, and how powerful that metaphor is, because there's so many efforts to fix the cage, to reform the cage, to put Wi-Fi in the cage, to do all kinds of things, right? But at the end of the day, Tagore is reminding us that the cage is still a cage. And so part of this struggle for freedom is how do we come out of that cage and many other cages that have been built for us in the name of civilizing us, And so, so I think that's also an important thing. I'm going to just do one thing. The last thing I would like to say in terms of a little bit of context, there's about 6 million in India, 6 million. Yeah, if you can just. Okay, yeah, 6 million children today who don't go to school in India. So we have, I think, the largest number of self-designed free learners in the world. And we have about 147 million young people who've left school, who are also in this. So for us, it's like really, really important to try to create other opportunities and help restore schooling, I've gone on many official records as saying that schooling might be the most criminal activity of our times. And the way that we today look at disdain at slavery or apartheid, 20 years, 30 years from now, people will start waking up and saying, how could we have done this to innocent children? This is a crime against humanity. So, so I think that this thing that 147 million people have been called failures by the system. So all of us, I have been for a long time, I still am an activist at heart. And the reason I got into education was because I believed that there was a need for social change, equity, overcoming violence, poverty, all these important things that are crazy things that are happening in the world. And as I got deeper into education, I started to see that, you know, this system is not actually a vehicle for social change. It's failed. The liberal progressive dream that education for all would lead to social equity, social justice, is actually a big con game. It's a failure. It has not worked around the planet, right? So that puts us in a very precarious position then, right? Of like, what do we do now? Because I had, and many of my friends had said that education is going to be the tool for social upliftment. And so I think that's the context we're working with when you start to realize that it's not that tool, and it's actually for a very different, maybe it's for, I mean, enslavement is a better way to think about it, right? So then it's an invitation to actually say, can we, with all our good intentions, start to think outside of the way that social change has been framed. So the second invitation that I would like to offer you is to start to see self-designed learning or natural learning or unschooling or homeschooling as one of the most powerful and radical and important movements on the planet today. How does that sound? So that's the invitation to start to see what are we doing. Obviously, our children are the most precious and important things for us and beings for us in our lives. But we are also, again, part of a much larger thing that is happening on the planet right now. And there's a... yeah, I'm good. Yeah, so if we take this idea of learning reimagined seriously, what it means basically is we're not only reimagining learning, but the invitation is to reimagine everything. The entire ways we've been leading our lives, what we've been told is success, what we've been told is progress, what we've been told is happiness, what we've told is love, I mean, every dimension of what we've been told about food, what we've been told about waste, what we've been, waste is a modern creation, right? For example, I'm on a personal campaign to remove all dustbins also from the world because that legitimizes waste as an entity. But we can actually think of a zero waste world for ourselves and our children. But anyway, so all the aspects of our lives, the invitation, when we start in this idea of reimagining learning, is really to start to think that all of what we think about health, healing, medicine, vaccinations, all of these questions, food with genetically modified food. So all around the world, I find that families who are involved in this self-designed learning movement are actually at the forefront of asking these questions about how do we want to live together on this planet in ways that are going to be more beautiful, more safe, more just, more harmonious, more meaningful for all, right? So let me just pause here 1 second and share something. I didn't realize I didn't share anything about myself. So, so I was born in India, but my parents, I got kidnapped when I was 3 years old, and I was taken to America to be like that parrot, to be civilized and educated. So my parents went there, and I grew up in Chicago, and my first memory, very strong memory of self-designed learning was when I was 8 years old. I started a business, greeting card business, and I went around to our neighborhood, all our neighbors, and I would try to sell them greeting cards. And I was okay in business part of it, but I made beautiful relationships with so many of our neighbors, and particularly with Like I can remember one neighbor, one of my friends, her mother, she would always invite me in. We'd have nice, you can see an 8-year-old, cute little, I was much cuter then also. Very long conversations with somebody who I was, and this was again at the time when it was already bad to don't talk to your neighbors or strangers, something may happen to you. But I was going around and meeting all these interesting people. So that was like the start of my, I think, journey, that there was something much different ways to learn than sitting in a classroom. I have to confess, I was one of the kind of students that I went to a government public school there, and I was like one of the students that people used to hate, in the sense that I would never study, but I would do really well on tests. And so that put me in a very kind of precarious, I hated being in classes, but I was always in a very strange situation, because my parents were like, my mom is a doctor, my father's an engineer, and they were always like, this kid never studies, and he's doing so well, so you can imagine if he actually started studying, what would happen. So their thing was always to try to kind of control and put me back into this kind of box of what it means to be a good student. And the more they tried that, the more I rebelled and started doing more and more things outside of school. And those were all called extracurricular, right? And at some point I started realizing those weren't extra. Being in the class was extra, and all the other stuff that you do in life and with community and with your friends and your relatives and with nature, that's all the real learning that happened. So I'll just fast forward. I had a crazy journey when I was 28. I had already had multiple careers, so I was, believe it or not, nobody has any tomatoes here, right? Eggs, no? Okay, good. So I was an investment banker on Wall Street. We all have our dirty secrets, I know. So I was an investment banker on Wall Street. I thought if I got into the financial world, we could try to change the economic system and make the world more equitable and a better place. But I realized quickly that that wasn't happening. And then I thought I should become an academic. So despite hating school and never studying, I ended up at Harvard. And I was going to be doing a PhD from Harvard and all of that kind of stuff. And I decided that, no, that's not the place also for me to do the work I wanted in the world. And then the third place I ended up was with the UN. So I worked with the World Bank, with USAID, with UNICEF, with UNESCO, with all these agencies and many international NGOs. So at the end of 28, when I was age 28, I'd already done all this, and I reached a point of total, utter despair. Total disillusionment and despair. That I figured out by that age that the entire game was rigged. Right? And people from the global south, we're told it's just a matter of time before you catch up. Right? Just keep following diligently along the path and you'll catch up. But one could actually see from that level the whole game was rigged. And actually, at some point it hit me that actually, if we actually did catch up, it might be even worse. So that was a scary part. Like, we're never going to catch up in the game because it's defined in a certain way and it's rigged against people. And actually, if you do catch up by some strange coincidence, it might be a worse, form of the worst kind of colonization probably that would happen to human beings. So then at 28, I was at total despair of what to do now. Huh? Okay, good. So this total despair of what to do now for the planet. So I thought the only thing I could do, and the other thing that's, at that point, having grown up in the US and seen the US very closely, how things work, I started feeling the American dream was not a dream, but actually a nightmare. And so then the model of what to, the entire world has been told we have to emulate America. Growing up, that was it. The promised land, heaven on earth, that was America. I remember all my relatives in India always telling me that, and saying that this is. So that model started collapsing in my mind. So there's a question of now what to do. And so I was really in total despair, and I decided the best thing for me to do was to go and be with my illiterate village grandmother. Because I realized that she had a total different view of how life works in the world, on the planet, you know, what life is. There was a very interesting thing. From her, I started learning about the difference between knowing and being. Right? So all my Harvard professors knew a lot, but the level of their being was very, very unrefined, unsophisticated. It was missing, basically, right? So I started thinking that actually the part of the journey is how do we bring more alignment within myself and within my family and with the community of friends. So that was one important part of this journey. The other thing was when just at that time I decided to go back, I also met my wife, and we decided that, I was very clear by then that, you know, I don't want to have anything to do with schools, and for myself, for my children. And so she was like totally on board with that, and we were super excited. And we started telling our parents, and they were like, you guys are crazy. But they're like, okay, just get married, and then we'll talk about it afterwards, right? So, as you know, Indian parents, right? So, so eventually they all said, okay. So then I was like, oh, no. Me and my big mouth. I said I want to do all this, and how am I going to do it? I'm not at all equipped to do this. And so I thought the best way to start to do this is to, I remember this famous African proverb, right? It takes a village to raise a child. So I said, let us start to create that village. I flipped it on its head now. I say it's going to take our children to help us rebuild our villages, because we've lost those in modern industrial life, right? So then I said, let us start to create this sense of community for ourselves, for our own unlearning, and for our children and all any other families which would like to be part. So we started this center 18 years ago as a center, as a movement called Shikshantar. So I'm going to just quickly, I had so much to share, but let me just share a couple of things which I think, going to now open up. Hopefully this is giving you a sense of where I'm coming from, and we can have an interesting conversation. So there's a few things we've been, over the years, lots of kind of very radical experiments we've tried to support, because it's, as I said, we're visioning ourselves as part of a larger movement for changing the game on the planet. And so one thing that we did is we started a campaign called Healing Ourselves from the Diploma Disease. So the campaign is basically to, so one of the, I would like to say that, and I'm very conscious that I'm saying it in South Africa, degrees and diplomas are part of a new system of global apartheid. Because you have the degrees, guys who have a voice and who are allowed to speak and kind of make decisions, and those without degrees are seen as invisible, and their voices, their opinions don't matter. So we thought, how do we start to unravel? And the other thing is this monopoly of this system, the current system, is built on degrees and diplomas. So how do we unravel that game? So we now have more than 700 organizations, small businesses, social movements who are ready to hire young people without any degree or diploma. And our dream is to have that to be, if we get it up to 10,000, it's going to be amazing. So that is one of the things, is how do we shake this monopoly of the degree and diploma? Because I keep getting these on Facebook, people from different homeschooling and unschooling communities. Someone says, oh, we should be so proud our child got into MIT. But that's not the game. That's, again, fitting our children back into the rat race, right? And I think that ultimately there's a thing I would want to share. There's a thing that I use in some of the other work I do, which is when we think about success and failure, there are 4 levels we can think at. So one is like personal success and failure. Second is organizational. Third is like sectoral. And fourth is systemic. And so personally, we might be doing, what we're all doing is probably giving us greater happiness and our children greater happiness. As a community, we are also starting to grow in numbers. We're trying to get more interesting people. Lots of things are interesting, powerful things are happening as a community. Sectorially, as an education system, things are getting worse and worse for people. And systemically, we are on the verge, according to many, many thinkers around the planet, on a total collapse. The game that's being played is collapsing in many different ways. So what the invitation is that we start to think also about what we're doing at these other levels. And so part of the thing is, how do we unravel the game of degrees and diplomas? Because that then starts to make a whole bunch of opportunities for lots of people who don't have those degrees and diplomas. The second thing that we did, my mom is my biggest skeptic, I have to confess, right? She's a doctor, so I can't blame her. So she said, okay, that's okay, but your daughter won't have a degree or diploma. What if she wants to go to university? Then you have to do all this stuff. Like, we have a campaign also called Exams Kill. So it's a huge, hashtag exams kill. So I'm totally against the examination system. So she's like, well, if your daughter wants to go to, are you taking that opportunity from her? I said, that's a good one. What to do? So I said, okay, let me do something. I'll start my own university. So 7 years ago, we started our own university called Swaraj University. We have more than 150 learners who are part of that, who are all doing their own self-designed learning programs. And we are also trying to build a whole community of support within all those people. The most interesting thing that I've been working on with that now is we now have built a network called the Ecoversities Network. And we have more than 50 radical alternative universities around the planet which have all connected to create opportunities for young people. So your child doesn't need an exam. Your child doesn't need any exam or any diploma, and they can go and be part of really interesting radical universities which are expanding their consciousness and their connectedness on the planet in all kinds of ways. So that is it. And one more thing I will, oh God, so many things. One more thing. So one thing we've been interestingly also working on is a campaign. It's in 52 Parinde. So some of the learners who are part of our university, we call them actually Kojis. Koji means seekers. So the idea of what the university should, we're all born with different purposes, different life missions, different reasons why we've come to this earth, right? So the idea of any place of learning should be to help you realize what is my deeper purpose from being on this planet. So a couple of them started working with me. We said, actually the problem is also not that if we get young people get through, what do they do when they get older? How are they going to earn their livelihood? We know that in India, at least I can say pretty much constantly for the rest of the planet, the last 100 years of economic growth has been basically about destroying the planet, trashing the planet, right? So the last 100, all the industries, all the stuff we've done to show growth is trashing the planet. So what we're saying is the next 100 years and our livelihoods have to be designed in a way that we are regenerating life on the planet. So any meaningful work has to be regenerative in nature, because we spent the last 100 years basically destroying everything. So what are those livelihoods? So we did a whole couple of learners for us. They spent a whole year, 1 week in each place, visiting 52 different kinds of people and projects to highlight there are 52 new kinds of socially just eco-careers that are out there for people. And none of those careers, the good news is, requires any degree to get into it. We're trying to say that there are many more ways that we can think about our livelihood than what the system has been giving us, which is to turn us into people who are destroying our homes, right? So let me just stop it there and leave some time for, hopefully I've turned up. There's lots of other things that we're doing, and I'd love over the next 2 days to learn from you and share these also. But the invitation is to see again, just to see ourselves as part of a much broader, more radical movement for change, for changing the game on this planet, for sacredness of life. How do we reinvite it back into our own life and to the ways we live and work on the planet?
I'm curious how you think and feel about national hierarchies, especially coming from India, the caste system, South Africa, we have the whole colonization thing. A lot of people, well, some people, especially the conservative side, will say hierarchies is a natural phenomenon in virtually everything from lobsters up to the food chain. Therefore, we should maintain. Other people will say that's because of hierarchies that we have oppression, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
So, I'm going to indirectly answer your question. So, whenever I've learned about, like I mentioned, that this is a long lineage that we're all connected to for thousands of years. So one thing that I've been able to allow from that is that there are three things which were very essential for deep learning to happen. So one was, and I would say deep learning and deep wisdom to happen. So one was mutuality. So you all have heard of the guru-disciple system. So that was nothing like schooling. The essential was there was a mutuality of relationship that was built and agreed upon by the guru and by the learner. And there was no imposition. See, in India today, even if you go to somebody and you say, hey, Laura, guess what? I'm your guru. What is Laura going to do if she's in India? She's going to be laughing her head off. Because there's no tradition of, the guru can never impose themselves on anybody. Right? It was always invited. So there was, on both sides, there was a mutuality. So this is one of the essential parts to start to think about. The interesting thing in that mutuality, once you invite that, if I invite Andre as my guru, I am willing for a reasonable and temporary period to surrender. Surrender is a good word, I think. Because it's based on trust. Right? There's an underlying trust that I will surrender to your wisdom and your understanding to help guide me in my journey. If I feel at any point that that's being abused or it's not serving my journey, I have the right to discontinue the relationship. So that's, I think, a very important thing. The second thing is diversity. Right? Schooling is essentially a monoculture, right? It creates monoculture of the mind. All of our traditional ancient systems were essentially about diversity. And in India, we have 330 million gods. So that can tell you a little bit about the diversity that exists there, and that's acceptable, right? So diversity, and nowadays people talk a lot about how do we mainstream our children, right? Sakia was talking a lot about decolonizing is a big thing that people are talking about here. So I've been working on this for a long time. So one of the things we have to decolonize is this idea of, mainstream. And so diversity. So there was no one model of what the guru-kul was or how the guru-disciple relationship should be. It was diverse. And that diversity then lets us out of these traps of competition, comparison, all of those things which emerge when you say there's only one right way. Right? And the third thing was humility, deep humility. So this, I'm sure you've all heard of this. One of my favorite quotes is, the more I know about how little I know. So this is fundamental to the thing. Whereas modern education, I think, produces basically two things, fear and arrogance. So this arrogance is there. So if these things are being built in the system, then the question of hierarchy becomes a very different question, I think. Right? And there are always places, because the other thing that I would want to say is that I believe one of the things we've tried to create, oh shoot, I forgot to tell you my two other invitations. So one of the things that I find most magical about the kind of communities that are emerging on self-designed learning is that the reclaiming of intergenerational learning spaces. So I was so happy to meet Andrew, whose grandfather, he's a grandfather, he's come here, and we have all these children. And how do we redesign our spaces to support this kind of intergenerational learning? Because this, and I always say that if we want to recover wisdom in the world, we need to get generations to be together again. This fragmentation is a way to destroy wisdom. So, yes, that's it. And the other thing, what was it? There was one more thing I forgot to say, but I'll think of it. Anyone else would?
You said you had 2 more invitations.
Yes, I'm just forgetting what the other, hold on, let me just, okay, I know. So, we don't use, I don't like these words, homeschooling, unschooling, for several reasons, but one of the reasons is that reference point becomes school still somehow. So we have to, part of freeing our minds is that school is not even our reference point. The second reason is that I've seen it very strongly in the US, and I'm warning friends from all over the world to not do the same. The US, the homeschooling movement has reproduced itself in a bubble. So as soon as we say that we are interested in learning from life, the door should be open to all kinds of people, right? All kinds of diversity, all kinds of people doing cool stuff and creative stuff and amazing stuff around the world. So this line that we draw between those who are the good guys, the homeschoolers, the unschoolers. I told you I have a daughter also 15 years old. She's never gone to school. These lines are all artificial lines. And the movement, to be a player in the bigger movement, means that we open up, we dilute, we diffuse those lines. And so we have people who are doing all kinds, permaculture people, people from indigenous movements, people from doing, anti-vaccine work. I mean, all kinds of, reclaiming our own healing. All of these people are allies in the same game for us. And so the invitation is to hold that line. I mean, it's important for creating a container and a community, but to hold the line very, very lightly. So we use the word learning societies. So we have an annual learning societies and conference, and we have all kinds of people doing beautiful, amazing things coming together. And at the core of it is a new way of either unlearning or learning that they're doing, right? Whether they're working on new kinds of, much more natural ways of farming, or natural ways of healing, or natural ways of living, or natural ways of creating. They're all part of a much larger movement. And those are fantastic people for our children to meet. And so that's the other invitation, is can we open the boundaries? Because this definition of homeschooling, this is coming predominantly from America. So part of the decolonizing is to see our own richness that we have. See, I think one of the things that I had to learn, I was taught through Harvard, through the UN, that India and South Africa and many other places, we're all poor countries. We're poor, we're underdeveloped, we have low education rates, right? So that's the mindset of the schooling, the colonized schooling mindset. The invitation is to see that we are super rich. We are super abundant. We live in abundance, our people. That's the only way we survive, right? And the gifts that are there that are not recognized by the official system, it's time that we start seeing those gifts and inviting those gifts into this for ourselves and for our children. So that's the other invitation.